Alright, back of your vocab sheet has a chart. I want to just briefly tell you about the difference between the preterite tense, which we've already done, and the imperfect tense, which is what we're going to do this week. Imperfect is very easy. It's the easiest topic we'll cover in Spanish too. I'm going to leave the hard stuff for after spring break. But they're both past tenses. Okay. So to briefly tell you the difference of when one is used versus when the other one is used. We used to cover in Spanish 2 a whole chapter over the difference of when to use preterite versus when to use imperfect. Because the school year was shortened, we decided to go ahead and move that to Spanish 3. So if you're moving on, then you'll get the specifics of when to use one versus when to use the other, which is kind of a comparison. Like in Spanish 1, when we did when to use a ser and when to use a estar, you have to know when to use each one. This is kind of like a higher comparison because ser and estar are just two verbs that mean to be. In this case, it's two tenses, two entirely different verb tenses that are both past tense, but there's instances where you use one versus when you use the other. So it's kind of like a higher degree of comparison, if that makes sense. So briefly, just for a quick overview of the differences between the two tenses, I'm going to give this to you as reference. You will not be responsible for knowing when you use one versus when you use the other until Spanish 3. You move on. For our purposes this week, all we're doing is focusing on the imperfect tense alone, and then when we come back from spring break, we're going to do preterite tense, a few more things that are irregular about preterite. Okay? But you'll see that imperfect is very easy. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about imperfect today. It's going to be very quick, easy. That's why we're only spending 1 week on it. Okay? But for the preterite tense, if you look on page 68, in your book, it basically tells you that it's a one-time thing. Okay? Page 68 tells you in Spanish there are two simple past tenses. The preterite tense, which you've already learned, is used to state an action that began and ended at a specific time in the past. The other simple tense is the imperfect tense. So action began and ended at a specific time in the past. That's from your book. So if you want to look on page 68, you do that. We've learned a few irregulars so far on the preterite side. We will learn a lot more. Preterite is a very interesting tense, and that's why we spend a lot of time on it in Spanish too. And you'll see that there's different categories, different families of what's irregular, and we'll do that when we come back from spring break. Okay. But in a nutshell, just like when we did the comparison of ser and estar, what was the kind of overall comparison of ser was more what than estar?
Permanent.
Right. So ser was more permanent and estar was more temporary. In this case, the big kind of comparison here is that preterite is usually a one-time thing in the past. Okay, so it happened one time. Versus the imperfect tense, which is what we're going to focus on today, is normally talking about something that happened repeatedly or habitually. Okay. So obviously happened more than once. If you look at page 68 under number 2, it tells you the imperfect tense is used to describe a habitual or repeated action in the past. The exact times when the action began and ended are not important. These are the forms of AR in the imperfect, and it tells you your forms of AR endings, which we're going to get to here in a minute. For now, just comparing the two tenses. Okay? But for reference, it's on page 68 of your book as well. So, habitual repeated past action. So it happened many times. Whenever you use the phrase used to, I used to play on the beach every summer when I was little. Okay. That tells you that it happened more than once. If you used to do it, you didn't just do it once, you used to do it more than once. So used to is understood as part of the translation of a verb. For example, if I want to say I used to play, you don't need an actual word for used to. The verb conjugated, the verb to play conjugated in the imperfect tense can mean I played or I used to play. So it's all just one word. It's understood as part of the translation of the verb. As your book told you, it's not really referring to a specific time, so it's a non-specific time. However, one of the specific reasons of when to use imperfect is when you tell time in the past. slightly confusing because you're not really referring to last summer I did something. But if you're talking about at 7 o'clock this morning something happened, then you would use the imperfect tense. Okay, so there's specific reasons why you use it sometimes. Whenever you're referring to age or time, for example, a long time ago, I used to do this, or as a child I used to do this. When I was young, I did this. Okay, so whenever you're referring to age or time, that will always be imperfect. Okay, but just know that used to is part of the translation. So I used to speak Portuguese when I was little. Well, still do, but the used to will be understood as part of the translation when you conjugate the verb to speak. Does that make sense? On page 74, we're going to look at it in just a few minutes. There are more uses of the imperfect tense. Description being a big one. Anytime you describe anything in the past tense, it'll always be, instead of using the preterite tense, you're going to be using the imperfect conjugations, which we're about to tell you. Okay. So just for your reference, if you want to jot it down here on the back of your vocab, you have page 74 as a reference. We're going to use the imperfect tense, and then we're going to do some more notes here in just a second. And you will not have to know the difference of when to use one tense versus the other. All you have to know is that they're both past tenses, and that we will focus strictly on just the imperfect tense for now.